Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. Continuing to explore the multicultural landscape of Polish literature, having covered some Yiddish writers and looking at the interaction between Poland and Ukrainian literature today, I'd like to look at poetry written originally in the language of the Roma people, by Poland's most famous Roma poet, Bronisława Wajs, who was known as Papusza, which means doll in the Polish Roma dialect. We'll save the background and biography for our guest, who is much more of an expert on this topic than I am, but let me say that I first learned about Emilia Kledzik's work in a controversial recent interview in Poland's main independent daily paper, Gazeta Wyborcza. And many people who had not yet had the opportunity to read Dr. Kledzik's 600-plus page book took it as an unfair attack on the work of much-beloved poet and researcher Jerzy Ficowski, who was an important poet in his own right, and who discovered Papusza as a poet and dedicated much of his life to finding the scattered traces of Bruno Schulz. I think that while we are all grateful for Ficowski's tireless and absolutely sincere endeavors, since, after all, there would probably be no scholarship whatsoever on Papusza, and we would be much further behind where we are today on Schulz without Ficowski's work, we have to acknowledge that as a pioneer, he was working in a very different era intellectually. In the early 1950s, for instance, Stalinism and censorship were in effect. We did not have the academic discourses we have today of Orientalism, of minor literatures, or how to approach the other with a capital O, or the critiques of romantic nationalism that we consider today. Roma studies were primarily conducted by people who were not themselves Roma, and there were few modern resources on Roma culture and society in that era beyond 19th century compendia. So today, there are reassessments, but reassessments that would not exist without Jerzy Ficowski having taken the first steps. So before we meet Emilia, I'd like to remind you to subscribe if you like our series, click the bell to receive notifications about new episodes, and follow our playlist down in the description below to catch up on past episodes. I should also make a note about the so-called G word, gypsy, which translates directly as Cygan in Polish, and which we will try to use in a very restricted sense because many modern Roma, Sinti travelers and members of related groups find it offensive, and rightly so. Yet sometimes we might need to quote works where that term is used, or we might be referring to historical conceptions of the Roma where we mark that historical context with this outdated term. Emilia Kledzik works at the Laboratory of Literary and Cultural Comparative Studies at the Faculty of Polish and Classical Philology of Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. She is the author of the monograph Perspektywy poety, Cyganologia Jerzego Ficowskiego, the Poet's Perspective, the Gypsy Studies of Jerzy Ficowski, published in Poznań in 2023, and is editor-in-chief of the Journal on Comparative Studies, Porównania, Comparisons. Emilia, thank you for joining me on Encounters with Polish Literature.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't you tell us what was the situation of the Roma in Poland around the time before and after the war, and in the period of Papusza's life?
It's actually hard to judge how many Roma people lived in Poland before and after the war. Historians say that before the war it could be around 50,000 different Roma groups, and after the war it's around 15 or 20,000. As I said, it's very hard to judge, also because the shape of Poland, the borders moved, right, and because of the huge migration after the war. So basically, after the war, the main Roma group in Poland is called Polska Roma, so the Polish Roma. They come from the German groups, and they've got some German words in their language. The group is very conservative, actually, the most conservative among other Polish Roma groups. So they basically lived in the eastern part of Poland, so in Volhynia, and this is also the place where Papusza and her family came from. So after the war, the main issue was that they had to move from those parts of Poland to the western parts of Poland, together with the huge migration to the so-called regained territories. And as you all know, I mean, there's a huge migration of around 2 million people moved to this part of Poland, to the western part of Poland.
These were Poles who were in the parts of pre-war Poland that became Ukraine after the war.
Exactly, and Belarus, and mainly the Soviet Union, right? So these were the Roma people. Obviously, had to move with those Polish migrants, because they identified themselves as Polish people, right? They spoke Polish. They were perfectly bilingual, so they spoke Polish and Roma language. So the main problem for those communities was to settle down in this new part of Poland, to find a place to stay. And the Polish neighbors were not particularly friendly to them, right? So it was not quite easy for them to find a good place to stay. And also the stereotype that says that Roma people are traditionally, nomadic people, and they like wandering around, and they prefer staying in the forest, was also say against them, because if they strategically want to live in the forest, then why shall we offer them a nice place to stay, right? So this was the main problem after the war. And another thing, and I wouldn't call it a problem, but it was something that's really unique in Poland, is that directly after the war, a very let's say political action of settlement began, and it was not only the action of let's say trying to make the Roma people live like normal people, like normal Polish people, but also it was an action aimed at helping them get medical care, get vaccinated, or get to schools, right? So learn to read and write and so on. So actually Poland was, I'm saying it was a unique thing, because Poland actually was the first country to introduce this kind of policy. Although the Polish Roma community was only 20,000 people, right? So it was like, I don't know, a promile of Polish society at the time. So although there were other countries in the Soviet bloc that had a much higher Roma community at this time, it was Poland that decided to introduce this kind of policy, probably because, it's hard to judge, but probably because Poland was a totally ruined country, and we need people to build it again. So as we all know, for example, the city of Nowa Huta was built with help of Roma communities, and many other cities in Poland. So the settlement action that actually began in 1949, it began with this registration system. So at first they had to count how many Roma people exactly there were. It was, I would call it a kind of modernizing action, right? So at first they wanted to count them, then to help them really be a part of the society, new society. Actually it changed in the 60s when the, let's say, nationalists came to power, and there was another part of the settlement action, which was a very brutal one, actually, and it had nothing to do with modernization things. But at the beginning, at the turn of 40s and 50s, the idea was to help them be a part of new Polish society. So that was, that's probably the brief introduction to the situation of Papusza.
And let's say, who was Papusza? Bronisława Wajs.
Right. I think it's very safe to say that she is now the most recognizable Roma poet in the world. And she was also the most recognizable Polish Roma poet. And well, the circumstances of writing her poetry were quite mysterious, and we don't really know much about her biography. The only things we knew from Jerzy Ficowski, who called himself her discoverer, the discoverer of her talent, and also was the editor and translator of her poems. And a part of his monograph, Gypsies in Poland. This monograph was published in the 50s and then in the 60s and then again in the 80s. And the last edition is actually from this year. Mm-hmm. So it's probably the most popular book on Polish Roma. So a part of this book, a chapter of this book was also devoted to Papusza. So, well, let's say what we know. What we know for sure is that she was born in 1908 in Sitaniec. Sitaniec is a city near Lublin, so like eastern part of Poland. We know that her mother was an unmarried woman. Her name was Katarzyna Zielińska, and as she, or Papusza, said herself in her pamiętnik, memoir, right?
Memoir,
yeah. So she said that her father died in Siberia when she was a small kid, right? And then after her father died, you know that Siberia was a place that many prisoners were sent by the Soviet Union, right? So probably he was a kind of prisoner or something like this. So 5 years after her father died in Siberia, her mother, Katarzyna Zielińska, decided to marry Jan Wajs. So then she changed her name into Wajs. And then Papusza also got married when she was, I think, 15 years old. But the marriage was not a happy one, as she described it as in her own words, that probably there were also some problems with or crime problems, and her husband had to go to prison. So she wasn't happy in this marriage. And then in late 1920s, she got married to Bronisława Wajs. It was the brother of her stepfather, so it was her uncle, right? And he was like 23 years older than she was. Right. In all of the stories with Papusza, so if you read, for example, a book by Isabel Fonseca, or a film by Krause, Joanna Kos-Krause and Krzysztof Krause, they say that this marriage was also very unhappy, and that Papusza was not happy with this old guy, like 23 years senior to her. But still, from the letters I know that Papusza wrote to Ficowski, it's not the way it was. Actually, that was a very good marriage. I mean, she took care of him and he took care of her the way they could. So it's like a very stereotypical way of thinking that she was unhappy in this marriage because he was like 23 years older than she was. They were musicians, actually. So they were like traveling around Grodno region, and then they moved also to the south, to Volhynia region, and they had this music band, very well-known music band. So that's basically what they did for a living. And Papusza also mentioned that she did some fortune telling during the concerts and normal stuff, right? So right, so they were based in Volhynia region, and that's also where the war began. They were there. And as you know, this area from 1943 was also the area of strong attacks of Ukrainian nationalists against Polish society living there. And what's very touching is that Papusza was a witness, she was witnessing those events, and she also, her family was Polish Roma family. And there is this wonderful testimony of her. The title is The Tears of Blood, when she describes what she saw in Volhynia in this time. And also there's also about the strategies they had to make in order to survive, right? Because they were, as Polish Roma, they were also like treated as Polish people by the Ukrainian nationalists, right? So they had sometimes they had to pretend they were not Polish, they were Ukrainian, so they had to change their names, they had to change their religion. Like so, Papusza is describing, for example, how to make cross in the Catholic and Orthodox way, so they had to change it. So this is a fascinating story and also a very traumatic one. I mean, this is actually a poem about war trauma. The only one I'm actually aware of that was written down by a Roma writer from this time. So this is the only Roma testimony from this Volhynia massacre. So this is where they survived, and they basically survived in the woods, and they were trying to get in touch with Polish troops somehow. And what's surprising that they were only also those Soviet troops that were helping them. So basically, in the Polish literature, we find only bad descriptions of Soviet troops, right? What Papusza says the opposite, right? So she says that we were really grateful to the Soviet partisans for helping them in the woods. And after the war, at first they were still in Volhynia, but in I think it was 1947 they decided to move to the west. And a friend of them, Andrzej Czarnecki, he was a good friend of them from Volhynia times, helped them to settle somewhere around Wrocław, but it was not for a long time. So they decided to move to the north, and in 1949 they were in the region of Szczecin. And the problem was that they were not allowed to do their job legally anymore in Poland, because musicians needed a kind of exam, or like a state exam, that they are really a folk bands or whatever. So obviously they didn't know how to get it right, and they were looking for any kind of help. And this is this is the moment when Ficowski appears, right? Because Ficowski was at this time he was 27 or 26 years old, and he was very fascinated in all minorities cultures, and especially Roma culture. And he was at this time occasionally publishing essays and articles on Roma.
We've talked about him a little on the program in relation to Bruno Schulz, since he was the discoverer of many of Bruno Schulz's artworks and texts and letters and so forth. And we had an episode on Schulz a few years ago.
All right. But I think that his passion for the Roma people and Roma culture was earlier. So it was it was actually the first thing. So Ficowski at this time was also publishing articles and essays on Roma history that were, these articles were in line with this settlement action I mentioned before, because, all those political actions, they need propaganda, and I mean, there's nothing wrong about it. It was a
publicity, let's say.
Right, let's say publicity, right. So Ficowski was writing those articles on history and culture of Roma people, and then he got also involved in a very important action, because he worked for this main commission of investigation of German crimes after the war. The commission was the commission was to actually. It was a team of Polish authorities that was collecting evidence for trials of Nazi criminals, right? So, for example, for Nuremberg trials. So what Ficowski did for this commission, he was preparing a report on Roma extermination during the Second World War, which is a very progressive thing at this time, right? Because when you say that Western Germany officially stated that the Third Reich committed genocide against Roma people only in the 80s. Right. Mm-hmm. So the fact that Wicowski gathered those materials, even thought of the crimes against Roma people as a genocide, was a very progressive thing.
Right.
And that's a pity that he didn't have actually good mentors. He had very powerful mentors, and I'm going to get back to this in a second, but he had no academic mentors, right? So they didn't tell them how to do this properly. So unfortunately, the report was never published, but also the circumstances changed, and the Holocaust became more and more nationalized and so on. But still, this report exists and became a part of his book, the monograph I mentioned before. Mm-hmm. So what Wicowski did, he because he was looking for evidence and he was looking for witnesses, so he published some in newspapers some appointments that if anyone saw any act of crime against the Roma during the Second World War, please contact me on this address and so on. So there were plenty of people writing him letters about what they saw. And that was also this Edward Czarnecki, so this friend of Papusza and her family, that wrote him a letter that he knows a group of Roma people that survived the war in Volhynia, and they are very eager to tell him the story. But they also need some help because they don't know how to manage the whole thing with earning the money by playing so let's say Wicowski is kindly invited to join them, to talk to them, to listen to their testimonies, but they want something back because they want to know how to perform. Get this, how to perform, right? Yeah. So it was in August 1949 when Wicowski went to the Szczecin region, and he spent there a couple of days with Papusza's family, and he also noted down their testimonies from the Volhynia times, and these are very powerful testimonies. And also this is the moment when he met Bronisława Wajs, and she promised him that she was going to send him her wartime memories in letters, right? Mm-hmm. So the first thing was that she, they decided to tell him the wartime story, and later on, when the whole correspondence between Wicowski and Papusza began, Wicowski had this idea that she's such a talented person that perhaps it could be also useful to publish some of her poems, right? As I said, this year, 1949, is this year when the state campaign, settlement campaign started off, and there was this famous interview by Julian Tuwim, and as I said, Wicowski had very powerful mentors, and one of them was Julian Tuwim.
Tuwim was one of the most, well-respected, serious poets of that era.
Yeah, Poland. That's right. Yeah. So, and he also, Julian Tuwim was also very fascinated with Roma culture, and he one of his poetic volumes has a title, A Gypsy Bible. So he was very much into this romantic view of Roma culture. So when Julian Tuwim learned that there is this young man, Jerzy Wicowski, who is so enthusiastic about Roma people, and there is this state campaign to settle Roma people down, he decided to do something about it, and he decided to make and publish an interview with Jerzy Wicowski, a very popular magazine at this time. The title of the magazine was Problemy. Wicowski, and in this interview, Wicowski explained what actually Roma history and culture and so on is, but also he said a couple of words about Papusza, and this was also the moment when he showed his support for the settlement action, right? So this was the moment when actually Papusza and her family got involved in the settlement action, which is an important issue, right? Because it later on became a problem for her and her closest family. Witowski's career at this time was has really taken off. I mean, he was giving lectures at Warsaw University on the Roma culture. He was publishing articles in the Journal of the Gypsy Lore Society, which is the most recognizable, or was the most recognizable journal on Roma culture at this time. So he was like, as for a 28-year-old young man, he had a very flourishing career, and he had very ambitious plans because he wanted to write a monograph. He wanted to publish a collection of Roma poetry, Polish poetry, and also international poetry. He wanted to write a novel on Roma, on his experiences with Roma people, and so on and so forth. Right. But at the same time, coming back to Papusza, at the same time, the family, as I said, was desperately looking for a place to stay in this western part of Poland. And it was not an easy task because they had constantly a feeling of being watched by the communist police, and moreover, they had this problems with Polish majority society. They had this feeling that they also are like victims of provocations of Polish majority society. So there was this letter from 1950 when Papusza wrote to Witowski about the death of a 5-year-old child in the forest. I mean, they were somewhere in the forest, and there was this boy got injured by a mine explosion that was in the forest. So this was the moment when she felt really like harassed and also disappointed that although they are working so hard in this forest, they don't get any satisfactory place to stay. And the tension within her group was growing. So there was this question: how come that you are now the face, you, Papusza, you are now the face of the settlement action? You are now in the newspapers, right? Witowski was publishing her poems in the newspapers. So how come that you are the face of the settlement action? You are like legitimizing it, and we are still in the woods, and we are dying here, and we have no place to stay, right? So the tension from her family was, as I can imagine, a huge one. So she finally decided to split with her family and with her mother, with her husband, and her son. Her son was an adopted Władysław Wajs. He came from a mixed Gadzio Roma family. So only with her mother.
You should say that Gadzio is the Roma term for white people.
Non-Roma, yeah, right.
Or non-Roma.
Right. Non-Roma. Yes, exactly. So so they decided to split, and they moved to Żagań, which is more like Zielona Góra region. It's more to the south. And then she got even closer contact with Jerzy Witowski, and she started publishing, and then he started publishing her poems in various journals, and especially in year 1952, it was the year of the so-called Operation C. And it is a funny story because the poem about mushrooms, this is a very lovely one.
We'll read some poems in a moment. Yeah, we should.
All right. Okay. So then, because that's this poem also mentions this action, and I think it's a very nice thing. So, as I said, the image of Papusza became a very important part of this communist settlement propaganda, and it was a real propaganda at this time. What Witowski did with this poetry is that not only stressed that she is this pro-modernizing, pro-settlement action, but he also said that it is a very traditional gypsy style folk song, right? So it's a very traditional, at the same time, it is a step towards modernity, if you know what I mean. Right. So then in 1953, finally the monograph Polish Gypsies appeared. So Witowski published his opus magnum. It was a very very typical book on the so-called gypsies. So it included parts on history, on the the traditional way of living, also traditional jobs, also on Papusza and so on. So it's like describing the whole ethnic group in one book that is 200 pages long. So as I said, there was also a chapter on Papusza with a very detailed biographical facts on her and also her poems. When the book was published, Papusza had a nervous breakdown. And we know from letters that her husband wrote to Witowski because she was not able to write to him anymore. And her husband was then in charge for contacting with Jerzy Witowski. So that she even asked him to destroy all the book, right? The whole edition of the book.
It's a very dramatic scene in Krause's film.
It is. But actually, the reason why she asked him to destroy the whole edition was not clear because what Witowski said is that she was banned. She was cursed by her own family and her own community because she gave some secrets out, a taboo, or she allowed him to publish in Roma language, and she told him some details about marriage, sexual life, or whatever. But in fact, what is quite obvious from the correspondence between Papusza and Witowski, it was not the problem of those taboo secrets or whatever. But
what I thought the film implied was that there was this kind of Roma court scene, right? And the implication is that by publishing a bilingual volume, which would be kind of a Rosetta Stone that would reveal the language, details of the language, that they might expose some kind of criminal activity.
This is the way Witowski put it, right? That it is just like not Papusza's fault, right? And this is this community, which is a very conservative one. And I don't say it's not true, because I know that there are some conservative Polish Roma communities who are very critical against the fact that, for example, Roma language is now in Google Translate, right? But it's more like a traditional style. I would say that the problem here is that Papusza got involved in this political action, right? Very harshly. Right. And there was this nice film by Greg Kowalski at the beginning of the 90s, and I think it's still somewhere on YouTube where Greg Kowalski says that, and also there is this son by Papusza, Włodzimierz Wajs, and he also says that it's because of the political involvement, right? That Papusza had no idea that she's getting involved in state political action that's actually working against the Roma. So. Right. So this is the moment when she had this breakdown, and she was hospitalized in a hospital for nervously and mentally ill in Lubliniec for a couple of months, and this was the moment when she was not able to write to Witowski anymore, and actually this was the moment when their correspondence broke. So this is, they exchanged a couple of letters later on, at the turn of 60s and 70s, when Witowski was trying to revive the whole story, the whole myth, and the whole Papusza's poetry, but it was not that close anymore. It's quite obvious that it's over in this 1950. After the publication of his book, it's totally over. And at the same time, so at around the end of 1953, Witowski decided to apply to Wydawnictwo Ossolineum for a publication of a collection of Papusza's poems, right? So she was at the time in this hospital, right? She had this mental breakdown, and it was quite obvious it was because of the book, right? And then at the same time, Wicowski applied to Ossolineum to publish her poems. So Papusza's hospitalization was a long one. I mean, she spent there a couple of months. It was Bronisława Wajs who was in charge of communicating with Wicowski, but actually at the beginning, he didn't even know that Wicowski had those plans, right? And when I went through the correspondence between Wicowski and the publishing house, Ossolineum, it was quite obvious that he wants to be the person in charge of it, right? So he says that Papusza is now in hospital, and the one responsible for signing all the contracts is going to be Bronisława Wajs, but I'm the one who's going to take care of the whole translation and edition and so on. So what is quite striking is that Papusza actually had no say about the form, the introduction, the translation, anything about the book, right? And another striking thing is that she was perfectly bilingual. So she also, when Wicowski asked her to give him her poems, right? To write some poems. So she also wrote some poems in Polish, but these were not interesting for Jerzy Wicowski. The only interesting ones were those who Wicowski was able to translate, right? So only in translation those poems were like worthy to him, or I don't know how to put it. So it took the publishing house almost 3 years to publish this volume. It was the title is Pieśni Papuszy, for Papusza's song Papusza Kregila, and there are 13 poems in the book, and they are published in 3 versions. So we've got a poetic translation there, you've got literal translation, and the so-called original text, right? So the original texts are in Roma language. So we have this feeling that these are the texts taken from the letters, from the manuscripts. Then we've got this literal translation, which is very like close translation, which can be very interesting for people who, are interested in Roma language, because you can see how the language works here. And then we've got these poetic translations, and we need to underline the fact that basically the poetic translations were the base of translations of Papusza later on into different languages, right? So when different translators into German. We also got some translations into English, but these were published in Italian journal, Roma journal in the 80s. So basically no one knows them. But so we've got this
They're
German,
very hard to find any translations into English.
Yeah, but there are German translations, there are Swedish, there are Spanish, Japanese as well. But the basis of those translations were the poetical translations by Jerzy Wicowski. So they are very far away from the original versions, right? Even from the Roma versions Wicowski published in the book, right? The only translation that is actually from the Roma versions from Pieśni Papuszy, Papusza Kregila, is the French translation, which is done by Marcel Courtiade. He was himself a Rom, and he decided to translate those poems directly from the Romani. But, the problem is that those original versions that Wicowski put in the book are not really the original versions, because they are already edited versions, right? So, so this is the main problem.
And this, from looking at the manuscript letters, right?
Yes, exactly. Because the thing is that although many people try to go to the manuscripts, and as I said at the beginning, this process of constructing and editing and publishing those poems is a very mysterious one. And you can imagine that Papusza's book was a success, right? So it was published in this 1956. There were very enthusiastic reviews in newspapers by people like Wisława Szymborska, for example. Obviously, she was not a Nobel Prize winner at this time yet, but she had this, like a poetical hearing, right? So she said. So she was very enthusiastic about this poem, and also Julian Przyboś, so the very prominent poets from this time. So they wrote those reviews saying that this is the poetry we were waiting for, because it shows at the same time, it shows this gypsy spirit. There is still this gypsy spirit in it, but at the same time, it's like a very modern form, right? So it's a very close to the modern poetry. Because Papusza was started to be a very popular person at this time, people wanted some more of them, some more poems, right? So they wanted to see her, to meet with her, to listen to her. And she was unable to write, right? Because also what I learned from the letters is that the doctors told her that it's not healthy actually for her to write. That she got a headache when she's writing, and she's like, those psychotic condition is probably something that writing is not helping. Or sometimes it is, but not in Papusza's case, right? So obviously. We don't really know what kind of disease it was, right? But what we can say is that Papusza in the letters said that afterwards, so as I said at the beginning of at the turn of 60s and 70s, when Witowski started to ask her for her poems again, so she wrote him back that, well, she's afraid she's not able to write because the doctors told her not to do so, right? So okay, but still, at the end of the 50s, when her book was out and she was starting to be very popular, like the local artists from Gorzów Wielkopolski, because they moved to Gorzów Wielkopolski, it's also in the western part of Poland.
Yeah.
Yes, also in the so-called regained territories, like former German territories. So the local artists, and you can imagine that this local network of artists was not very, big at this time, right? So this was like a very fresh network. So what when they realized that they have a poet like this, Papusza, living in Gorzów Wielkopolski, they just wanted to show her, right? And then they realized that they had actually no contact with her, because the only person who is in charge with contacting her and the only person who's in charge of the poetry is Jerzy Witowski. And so they decided to search for her. And actually there was a huge scandal that broke out in it was 1958, I think, when it turned out that Papusza is actually in prison because she stole a chicken or something like this, and nobody knew that it was this famous poet, right? So, but it is also a very sad story, because it shows that her family was living in a very bad condition at this time, right? So those local artists and poets decided to help her, and actually they helped her a lot, because they got a new flat for her, right? There was also Jerzy Witowski also helped with kind of scholarship, and so they were very involved. But the problem was, she has to publish, right? She has to give her poems to the publicity. And there was this problem. So she didn't want to. And then so the local poets got to Witowski and said, okay, perhaps you can find something from the previous times in the letters. So he found something, they published it as new poems, but in fact they were not new, but they were from the beginning of the 50s. So it was enough for a couple of months, but then it finally stopped. And at the end of the 50s, Witowski said that the career of Papusza is over now. And it is over because of those, let's say, bad gypsies, because they didn't appreciate her talent, right? Well, it was over not because of the bad gypsies. It was over because of Papusza's illness, and it was over because of her nervous breakdown and her previous involvement in this political state campaign. Right. So the thing is that all right, and
so there are about like 30 poems, if I understand. Is that correct?
Yes.
But there are more in the letters. Is that the case? Okay.
Yeah.
How many poems would you guess there are?
I mean, it's very hard to guess because it depends what you mean by a poem, right?
Right. Well, yeah, these are they're different. You sent me a few of your Polish literal translations in Polish from Roma, which I've translated into English, so that we have some, because there's virtually nothing in English. This is supposedly the most famous Roma poet in the world, right? So and what do we have almost nothing to go on. So maybe we should take a look at some of these, and I can't completely vouch for them, because of course I don't read the Romani language, and it's difficult. It's so we're kind of playing the game of telephone. So I'm going through your intermediary Polish versions to get to my English version, and and they are quite difficult to read. I mean, they don't have one thing is, if we look at Witowski's versions, they're arranged like poetry into lines and stanzas and so forth. And the originals, most of them are not, or at least the ones a couple of them that you gave me are, but in general, they're not. It's like reading ancient Roman or Greek poetry, which is just like you're looking at a page of letters with no spaces, no capitalization, no punctuation. This is more than that. I mean, there are words, there are spaces, and there's some punctuation. Of course, Witowski had to insert that into his translations. I've tried not to do too much, but I put in a little. So because otherwise I can't read it even to myself. What shall we look at? Would you like to look at some of the poems from Volhynia?
Yeah, why not? And then probably the poem about mushrooms.
A couple of weeks after Emilia and I met for our discussion, a new volume of translations of Papusza's writings about the massacre in Volhynia came out, called Tears of Blood. And it is open access, so you can find a link to it in the bibliography on the introductory page to this episode on the Polish Cultural Institute New York website, linked in the description below. The volume follows Witowski's model more completely than Witowski did himself, in that it includes a facsimile of the diary, complete, the Roma text in print, a literal translation into English, or what translators sometimes call a pony, and a poetic translation by Hamish MacDonald, plus interpretive and explanatory essays, including one by our guest, Emilia Kledzik. So here, instead of one of my translations, which I was going to read, I'm going to read MacDonald's first translation from this new volume. "Oh, song, my sad song, no one knows, oh God, what will happen. A dozen of my family will be killed by the Germans. The Germans are chasing us, but they fear to go deeper into the forest. They do not allow us to go out where we want. They are surrounding the forest to fight with the partisans. The Romneys are weeping, asking God for his mercy. At night, all go out to steal, but sometimes bring nothing back. For 2-3 days, there's nothing to eat. Because of that, we go to sleep hungry. Eyes do not close. Everyone is watching the stars. Oh God, life can be good, but the Germans do not let us live. They are shooting, and fires like my songs go flying far away. Ah, you, my tiny star, before day breaks, you are so big and real over this world. Blind the Germans' eyes. Take them along twisting roads, show them a wrong turn, deceive them. Let Jewish and Roma children live. Let the German leader perish. Raise yourself around us, dear forest. Sing to them a song where our people walk. In front and at the back, let your song sound out. Laugh. Forest, forest thick with trees, mighty forest covered with leaves. A big battle rages. Germans, together with Ukrainians, are killing and wounding us and the Jews. They do not listen to anyone anymore, only to their own voices. Everywhere around, they have killed Catholics, poor Poles with their tongues cut out, their eyes gouged. Soon, all over the world, people will be poor. You, rich people, it is you who will then be poor, weeping tears of blood. So what do you think, my good company? Where can hundreds of people survive? It was bad, and it was good when it was warm outside. Some sunshine, some tears, wild blueberries to be gathered. We drank brews made from herbs, ate forest mushrooms, yes, and a few fishes too. Romanies cooked dead horses that had rotted for 2 or 3 weeks on the ground, but how miraculous that meat tasted. Roma children roasted potatoes on a fire. Those tasted sweet as marzipans. Once a week, poor Roma brought a dozen or two of them. So far, so good. But when freezing winter comes, what are Romanies to do with a small child? Where will they get a coat from? All the clothes are already in tatters. The flesh is naked. We want to die. No one has heard or knows about it. Only the sky and the river hear them cry. What evil eye has led us into such misfortune? Whose lips have cursed us? God, don't listen to them. Hear us. This night got colder, and old Romanies began to sing a Roma fairy tale. A golden winter will come, snowflakes will fall on the ground, on your arms like tiny stars. Black eyes will freeze over, little souls will die, not a single one of the old will survive to compose honest songs. The children began to cry. We want to eat. We have no strength left to keep on walking. The Germans surrounded the forest.
Some specialists in Roma literature say that we're looking at Romani epos, actually, something compared to the Iliad by Homer. Because actually, it says, if you look at the criteria, like definition of epos, it has to be about a very important for a nation, like an important event, all right? From a national point of view, it has to tell a history. That is an identity-building history. We actually have a kind of this here because you've got the Second World War, right? The trauma of the Second World War. And some historians say that if there is anything that unites Roma societies, Roma communities around the world, it is the Second World War trauma, actually. And it is true that the Roma political movement was built on this commemoration of the Holocaust, of the Romani Holocaust. And even structurally, if you take a look at the first stanza you read, it says piosenko to moja smutna. It's like an introduction to an epos, right? So
it's the invocation of the muse.
Exactly, it's the invocation, right? And what's very striking here is that, I'm very happy that thanks to the manuscripts, we have this contact with Papusza's imagination, even if it's like, a very close translation. And I'm a fan of close translation here because you can see that how language works, like how Roma language works here, how vivid the language was. But Pisowski was not able to publish this poem in the 50s because for obvious reasons, right? It was not allowed to publish anything about Volhynia, what happened in Volhynia between Ukrainians and Poland and Polish people at this time in the 50s because of the censorship, obviously. So Pisowski published like 30% of this poem, and it is like a manifesto about how war is bad and how that peace is important, that Roma people would like to live in peace. And it's also, and it is there, but much more is there because in the fragments you read, Papusza also mentions, for example, the fact that they were together with the Jewish people in the woods, right? That they were helping Jewish people, and also, they escaped to the forest because they previously lived in a ghetto in Kostopol in Volhynia, and they learned that there's going to be liquidation of this ghetto and an execution from various sources say different stories, from a German soldier, a gypsy German soldier, or whatever. Someone informed them, so they decided to escape to the woods. And stereotypically, we say that Roma people are adjusted to living in the forest, right? And we can see the opposite here. That she is afraid of the forest. That they know what to eat, the berries and so on. They know how to make a bonfire, but basically the woods is not a friendly place, right? And So what she's saying here is that it was quite fine when the weather was okay. So it was quite fine in the summer or in the autumn. But then when the winter began, a real horror began because they had no clothes. The children were dying actually, and they were hungry. And there's also the wonderful passages when Papusza is trying to be someone who's active there, because she's got no kids at this time, and she feels responsible for the other kids, right? So she decides to run away from the family and to steal some food and bring it to the family. So she wants to be the hero person here,
the provider, yeah.
Yes, the provider, and very 3 or 4 passages of this kind in the poem. When she wants to show herself as an active person, that she's actually from this post-traumatic point of view, is a very interesting thing. That she wants to be, someone who is in charge of the situation. That she's not passively just waiting to die. She's trying to act. And then I find it really, really touching when she's praying. She says that please do not show Germans the right way, the right path. Show them the bad one. This is really, this is very touching. And then later on in the poem, there are fragments about the Volhynia massacre as such.
Why don't I read another translation by Hamish MacDonald from the same book? This is called In February 1944. In February, the Gadros gave a single house for all of us, 3 rooms and 1 kitchen. We all got sick with consumption, Romani, and then I, and from me, all caught this disease. No one died, but all stayed 6 weeks in bed. Boiled raspberry twigs gave some strength, and with this brew, we began to heal. And today, in order to remember, we tell to all how this is done. God sent us a warm March. Only patches of snow remained. Other Gadros walked to the windows. Roma, how do you cross yourselves? The Roma eventually forget those adopted names, now call one another by our baptized names. Janek Bronia, Krysha Zosha. Only mine they did not recognize as a Roma name. This nickname was lucky. Gadros were holding big meetings on killing Roma. They ordered us to dig graves. They wanted to kill us. How much we cried. But the Gadros didn't even look. Sick men and women fell into the ground a day later. Over there, they kill all at night. Some kneel, pray to God, weep tears of blood. It would have been better to stay in the forests than to be with these Gadros who devour our flesh. We are men. Let's take up axes in hand before they kill us and later the children. A black night fell. I and Aromni let her soul rejoice at my gods because she has already died. Sprang out and went away. Like a big and black night, our soul blackened with fear. She and I are childless. Anyway, they will kill me and you.
There are some powerful metaphors here. The one I find especially powerful is this about a black soul. Because Papusza often describes herself and her community as black. Talking about the difference between Gadzio, non-Roma, and Roma. She says Roma are black people. This is also very interesting in my, it's worth a thought. So why is it so black and not brown, for example, right? But still, she says that her soul became even more black because of because she was so afraid, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a very this on the poetical level, this is a very powerful thing, but also from the historical point of view, like as I said, it is a testimony. So what she's saying here is that the Gadzios, so probably the Ukrainians, they gave them houses and flats that were empty because because they were Polish flats, right? And Polish people were killed. So the flats and the houses were empty. And there was Polish Roma who were pretending not to be Polish Roma, but Ukrainian Roma. They were allowed to live in those houses. And Papusza was actually, she didn't want to live there. She didn't want to wear those clothes. And she says, I don't know if here, but probably inside, and in the poem for sure, that she was the only one who refused wearing the clothes, the clothes that was taken away from the dead Polish people. So what she says here is that they lived in those houses, but they constantly had this feeling of being in danger because they were pretending not to be Polish, right? So they basically knew that it is a matter of time when they had to go. So and then because she's also mixing time levels here, she's sometimes describing the situation in February in 1944, but sometimes she's like, she's got those time backlashes enemy, and she's talking about something that happened previously, and probably this massacre she's talking about here, that when they wanted they made them dig the grave, and then this is probably something that happened earlier, but it's very hard to put it in a very chronological order, if you know what I mean. But still, you can see what's also interesting. This is the fragment when she says they eat our bodies. They eat our bodies, and this is the moment when I decided to. Because to eat someone's body is an idiom, actually, in Roma language. It means to kill someone, right? But I decided to break this idiom. I mean, to translate it literally, to show how the Romani language works. Because what kind of euphemism, if you know what I mean, it builds, right? They eat our bodies, right? It's like, it's a fascinating view, right? I mean, it's a fascinating description of killing someone. So this is the way I prefer it to be translated, because in this way we learn much more about how Romani culture is structured, thanks to the knowledge how Roma language works, right? But it needs a lot of comments, obviously, but it's worth it. I mean, I think it's better now.
Okay, let's look at the poem about mushrooms, which I think is a very powerful poem. This is dated 25 September 1952. Roma song. Many mushrooms grew on the Roma bonfires. Wild mushrooms in the Black Forest on Roma bonfires. Much happiness and much money grew out like the black heads of gypsy children. That year, the mushrooms themselves started to sing songs, tell tales. Our old gypsies of those mushroom years don't remember how we all were glad to pick mushrooms. The whole back of the hand hurt, eating the money they make, laughing, singing, and gabbing. Young black heads like gypsy children wore in that year. I can remember years past, making a nice tale. Wherever there were gypsy tracks, many mushrooms grew. Like our red skillets today, happiness and money for everyone. Great, happy black forests. Many mushrooms grew. Black-haired gypsy children have left the black forest, left the great happiness hidden in the mushrooms. Whoever picks mushrooms remembers the gypsies. There are no gypsies, no one to fear. Gypsy children have grown back like wild mushrooms in homes and have forgotten the forest. No forests are those that their fathers and mothers cried over. From those tears, many mushrooms grew. They covered the gypsy traces. Colonels, police grew like wild mushrooms. Let them be happy. Let the young people grow. Let everyone who picks mushrooms love them. So here, the mushrooms are, they're like symbols of the children, right? I mean,
yeah. I mean, the mushrooms are symbols of the children, and also there are songs hidden in the mushrooms, and there are also symbols of the lost, the woods that are not. The Roma people are not in the woods at the moment, right? They are not in the woods anymore. They are in houses, so they decided to settle down, right? So in a sense, this is also this kind of propaganda poem, right? But it's a very subversive one, and I will tell you why. Because
it certainly contains a sense of loss of the forest, right? I mean,
right, and you can say it like, I mean, you can see it here that there was happiness in the forest, right? But still, we can now go to the forest and pick those mushrooms, and mushrooms are happiness, and mushrooms are money, and picking mushrooms is also money making. Right. I mean, before I would get to the clue, I just wanted to say a couple of words about this, how it is composed, and the whole thing is that it's not a poem; it's actually a gili. Gili and Roma is a song, or something between a song and a poem, but it is always a very performative thing. So it has to be addressed to the audience, and this is the way Papusza designs all of her poems, as if they are performed, if they are, like oral thing, and like if they are addressed to Roma or non-Roma, it doesn't really matter. Because, for example, this poem "Tears of Blood" is addressed to the Roma community in order not to forget about what happened during the war. But this poem, because it is an oral poem and because it should be performed, it also contains some like idioms, or let's say rhetorical phrases, like for example, wishes for happiness, wishes for money. So I wish you all the best. I wish you good luck. This is very Roma. I mean, this is a very high context language, if you know what I mean. So it's a very so we say a lot of like those formulas, which are a sign of our respect to the audience, and are the sign of our good mood or whatever. So it's not a dramatic poetry, if you know what I mean. It's more like a very polite one. It's also here, right? When she says that, for example, I wish you all the best, or I wish you money, and I wish you good luck. But also, if you take a look at the end of the poem, she says that there are no Roma people in the woods, but there are some military, like militia men. If you take a look at the date, I mean, the poem was written on the 25th of September 1952. So it was only 2 days after the registration action during the settlement campaign. There was a huge settlement. There was a huge registration action called the Action C, like Cygan in Polish, Gypsy. When there were lots of militiamen that went to register, and they were registered actually almost 9,000 people at this time. So it was a huge during only 1 or 2 days, right? So she wrote the poem directly after this action, and she says there are no Roma people in the forest, but there are militia men in the forest, right? But I like them. I wish them all the best. And that's how she ends the poem. I mean, let them be healthy, let them be lucky. So it's actually a very, it's a lovely sense of humor. And well, if you don't know the context, you cannot actually see it. And I found it just by coincidence, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because I realized that it's actually so close to the sea, this registration action, right? So it's obviously, I mean, Pizowski blurred it, totally like cut it out in translation, but also for obvious reasons probably. But that the sense of poetry that comments on current situation. This is also something that does not really suit our vision of what gypsy poetry should look like, because in this like a typical stereotypical view of gypsy poetry, we say that this is a very ahistorical thing, right? That Roma as ethnic group, they have no historical memory, and therefore we, the majority society, should be responsible of writing this history down. And this is just like the opposite here, because Papusza is commenting on what's going on around her, right, in her own manner, right, because she's not attacking anyone. She's just like very humorously stating that instead of Roma people, there are militiamen there in the forest, but let them pick the mushrooms, right? So this is, I find it really funny.
On that note, I think we're short of time. Let me ask you. So what next? Do you think you might produce maybe an edition of Papusza's poems, or translations into Polish, or something along those? Since we don't have them, and that would be the key to getting more international translations of Papusza.
Well, I think it's not my responsibility, and I am not the one that should do this, to be honest. Because because of thinking of Roma communities, and since we have lovely educated artists and Roma people that actually feel the language better than I do, and that's quite obvious. And they speak also fluent Polish, so it's probably better for someone from the Roma community to translate those poems. I'm really keeping my fingers crossed for it, and I'm offering all my support to do this. But yes, I think that those poems should be translated again, in the original form, because well, I'd say a friend of mine who's a journalist, she said that these are very trance-like poems, like that. Very, they very much fit the contemporary aesthetics, right? Thinking about poetry, because in the 50s or in the 60s, we had a totally different sense of poetry aesthetics, right? And today we've got we like this tangled, contradictory form, performative form, and it's all there. So I think it's absolutely worth translating it into Polish and then into other languages, as you just did, and you did it great, I think. So
I'm not sure, but but what saying that the trance-like is that I was thinking I recently rewatched the 1974 documentary by Maya and Ryszard Wojcik of Ficowski and Papusza together, and I was thinking about how if you looked at these texts on the page in their literal form, you might not recognize them at first as poetry, but if you hear Papusza speak,
exactly,
she has such a rhythmic propulsion to her natural speech. There's one extended section where she's responding to Ficowski toward the end of the film. It's only 30 minutes, and even if you don't understand Polish, I recommend it, because you can get the sense of what it was that they saw in her language, just by this, listening to that trance-like quality of the way she would speak and kind of take over.
Yeah, and this is and when talking about epos and this kind of melody, this is also very important, right? Because she's got a certain phrase. There is a certain phrase. It is longer than the one Ficowski gave it in his translation, definitely, because it's a long one. It's an epic one, right? But it is there, and she's like, there's another one, like a radio interview, which she's in this radio interview. She's talking about her childhood memories and so on, and it is exactly the same, in the same manner, like she is talking poetry.
So thank you so much for joining us on the program and helping us, many years too late, introducing Papusza to in English again, to people who may not have heard about her.
Thank you very much.
Hang on. Please subscribe and click the bell to stay on top of the program. Watch the credits for some recommendations about how you can support aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians fleeing the war in their country. I'd like to thank all the people who helped make this series possible. The Polish Cultural Institute New York sponsors our program. Bartek Remisko, head of Humanities and Literature at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, is our executive producer. Natalia Iudin is my fellow producer and editor, and I'd like to give a special shout out to her mom, Anna Sorbiak, who curated an exhibition on the Roma at the Ethnographic Museum in Tarnów in the late 1990s. Our opening and closing music is by Radek Przedpełski. Thank you all for listening and for reading along with us. Let's meet again in a month for our 50th episode, when we will be talking about the great Polish Renaissance poet, Jan Kochanowski. It's about time. See you then.
To szary dzień, jak zawsze w tej okolicy. Cała sceneria dodaje się chwilami fotografią z ilustrowanej gazety. Tak szare, tak płaskie są domy, ludzie i pojazdy.